Hi everyone. Finally, the cat is out of the bag, and the US officials they have publicly released the text of a 14-point MoU, which is proposed to be signed between US and Iran on the 19th of June, Friday. I read the MoU several times, and each time I read, I found asking myself a rather uncomfortable question. What if the most important part of this agreement, and I won't say agreement, I would call it as understanding, is not what was added, but what actually disappeared quietly from the text and left to be discussed later. Usually, when the negotiations they end, most people they look at what each side received. Strategists they often look at what each side gave up, and these two scoreboards do not always tell the same story. Now, before we go any further, let me make one thing very clear. I am not going to analyze this document as a lawyer, so do not expect a point by point review. I'm not even going to analyze it as a diplomat. And yes, I'm not going to analyze it as a strategist as well. More specifically, I'm going to analyze this MoU through the lens I have spent most of my professional life using. The lens of incentives, leverage, negotiation dynamics, and strategic outcomes. Because whether you are negotiating a multi-million dollar business transformation, a corporate merger, a labor dispute, or a geopolitical settlement, one principle rarely changes. The side that improves its position relative to where it started usually walks away with the better deal. And that is exactly the lens I will use today. Not ideology, not politics, not personalities, just leverage. The question we'll answer today is not who signed what. The question that we are going to answer today is who has emerged stronger than they were before the conflict started on the 28th of Feb 2026. Also, let me be clear that today I'm neither comparing this MoU against some ideal outcome nor being unwelcoming of this MoU itself. Actually, I pretty much and I really admire President Trump today for making such a bold move. Now, for the sake of this podcast, each of the aspects of US-Iran relationships, which I call it as battlefields, will be considered as scenarios. And there will be like 6 different scenarios. And each scenario will be compared and mapped to a relevant section of the MoU with an outcome as to who won that particular scenario. So without further ado, let us get started with where did both America and Iran stand prior to beginning of the conflict on the 28th of Feb 2026. And this takes us to the battlefield 1, and this battlefield was sanctions. Before 28th Feb, America's biggest weapon wasn't a missile, it was sanctions. The Iranian oil exports were constrained. The Iranian assets were frozen. Economic pressure was real. Currency devaluation, joblessness, inflation, they were like on a rise and they were spiraling out of control. And America, it held all the economic choke points. Now today, 17 June 2026, after the release of framework outlining sanctions relief, oil waivers, and access to previously frozen assets as implementation proceeds, as highlighted in the MoU, think about that. Before the conflict, America possessed sanctions. Today, America is negotiating how and when those sanctions are removed. That doesn't automatically make the deal bad, but it does mean that America is giving up one of the strongest cards it ever held even before the hostilities ever began. So from a leverage perspective, the battlefield 1, the sanctions, I give it to advantage Iran. Now let's go to battlefield 2, the second major issue, and actually it was never an issue before 20th of Feb, and it came into the limelight after 20th of Feb, is the Strait of Hormuz. America, they wanted certainty. The markets, they wanted certainty, and energy consumers, they wanted certainty. And the MoU delivers exactly that as far as the Strait of Hormuz goes. The ships move, the oil flows, the markets calm down. Now that is a real achievement. But here's where the things become interesting and ironic at the same moment. The Strait of Hormuz was always open prior to 28th of Feb. And actually during the course of the escalation or during the course of the conflict is when Iran actually did the predictable. They choked the Strait of Hormuz. And somehow the US could not release that choke on the Strait of Hormuz. And actually the Strait of Hormuz became the biggest bargaining chip that Iran had by a blessing of the attack on the 28th of Feb 2026. Because that gave Iran a reason. So coming back to the framework, the framework doesn't simply reopen Hormuz. It also contemplates future discussions involving Iran, Oman and regional stakeholders regarding maritime services and administration. Well, most of the people would actually stop at reading that Strait of Hormuz is opened. But then again, as I said, the devil lies in the details. Just consider the stakeholders discussing a framework regarding the maritime services and administration. Now, the history has taught us that whenever the word services appears in an agreement, somebody is eventually paying for it. Who is going to pay for these services? The question is not whether the value will be created by these services. The question is, who captures that value? And as a businessman, I doubt Mr. Trump would believe in free lunches any more than he believes in free maritime services. Well, I won't. Now remember, there is a difference between removing influence and reorganizing influence. Now America, it seems to have solved the immediate problem. But the bigger question is whether Iran has preserved a role in the long-term structure. So my assessment on the battlefield 2, which is Strait of Hormuz, is a short-term advantage America. That's because this had become one of the major contention points across the globe, and Mr. Trump was in eye of that storm. And hostilities by Iran in the Strait of Hormuz were not enough. And then there was a Mr. Trump blockade in the Gulf of Oman. Now, with regards to a long-term advantage, well, I'll be forced to say that the long-term advantage leans slightly towards Iran, but only slightly. Because what we are looking at today is a framework, not the final product. Now think of a framework as a table of contents, not the book itself. The real story will be written when the book is written, when the framework is implemented. And the history suggests that major powers, they rarely step away when the most consequential chapters are being written. Now moving to battlefield 3, the nuclear question. Well, this had been the biggest issue that the US had with Iran since as many years I can remember have passed by. And it was also covered as a part of the JCPOA, but Mr. Trump believed that it was not as effective as he would be able to strike a deal. Now the framework, the current framework, it includes an Iranian commitment not to pursue nuclear options, or I would say not to pursue nuclear weapons. But then Iran has never pursued the nuclear options. Actually, if you look at within the Middle East, it is one of the countries which is actually a signatory to the NPT, and they were being regularly audited by the International Atomic Energy Association. So, anyways, the nuclear question became America's main objective. And America, I would say, Mr. Trump, he yet again deserves credit for obtaining that commitment that had actually existed forever. But I believe Mr. Trump would have got and would get a text which is much more crystal clear for enforcement with penalties included. Now, then comes the more important question. With this nuclear part of the framework, what physically changed between commitments and capabilities? What physically changed? Because commitments and capabilities are not the same thing. The reporting surrounding the framework suggests that the enriched uranium remains in Iran under IAEA supervision and downblending the arrangements rather than being removed from the Iranian territory. Well, that means the IAEA and in turn America gains oversight and Iran continues to retain possession, which means both sides can claim success. America got greater transparency, I believe, greater than JCPOA, and Iran continues to retain its assets. So this means this battlefield, it remains unresolved. There is no outright winner out there. Now moving to the battlefield 4, survival. This may be the most uncomfortable part of the analysis for me, to be frank. Now, before the hostilities began, there was open discussion about maximum pressure. Some commentators, they openly discussed regime instability. Some discussed regime change. And today, Iran, it remains intact. Iran, it remains sovereign. Iran, it remains at the negotiating table. And which I think they believe that they have the right cards. Now, whether one supports Iran or opposes Iran is irrelevant. I am not discussing morality. I am not discussing outcomes. I am not discussing human rights. Or I am not discussing freedom of speech. What I am discussing or what I am talking from is a purely strategic perspective. Survival was Iran's minimum objective. And Iran, it appears to have achieved it. And that matters a lot. Now moving to battlefield 5, which is diplomatic isolation. Well, on 28th February, Iran was largely being treated as a target of pressure. Today, Iran is part of a structured 60-day diplomatic process. That is not a small shift. Negotiations change incentives. The moment diplomatic process begins, the attention shifts from punishment to preservation. The attention shifts from attack to dialogue. The pressure, it gives way to process. And the process, it usually benefits from the side seeking time. So that doesn't mean Iran wins. It means Iran's position has certainly improved relative to where it stood before the hostilities. It seems like, and actually I believe, it goes with Iran. Now talking about battlefield 6, that's economic normalization. Now this is the battlefield that may ultimately matter most. Most governments, they survive on economics, not headlines. Economics, the framework, it envisages oil exports, asset releases, economic integration, or I would say economic reintegration, and potential $300 billion reconstruction and development mechanisms for Iran. Now compare this with Iran's position on the 28th of Feb. The difference is humongous. The economic trajectory is moving in the opposite direction from where Iran stood before the conflict on the 28th of February. And that is perhaps the strongest argument available to those who believe Iran improved its position through this process. Iran improved its position throughout this process. Now, that battlefield analysis or the battlefield scenario analysis brings me back to the question I had asked in the beginning. Is America stronger today than it was on the 28th of Feb 2026? My answer is, it depends on what you value. If you value stability, both America and Iran has gained. If you value lower oil prices, I would say America has gained. If you value avoiding a wider war, I would say America has gained and the world has also gained. But if you are one of those who measure or who value leverage, the picture becomes much more complicated. Because before hostilities, America possessed sanctions, frozen assets, economic pressure, and diplomatic isolation. Today, many of these tools are being converted into a diplomatic process whose ultimate outcome remains uncertain, unpredictable. At the same time, Iran appears to have improved its position in several areas that matter deeply to Iran: survival, economic relief, diplomatic engagement, and geopolitical reintegration. The potential long-term influence over issues that remain unresolved, which is why I believe the wrong question is, did America win or did Iran win? Because a better question is, compared to 28th of Feb 2026, whose position improved more? And that is the question history will answer over the next 60 days. Until next time, remember, headlines tell you what happened. Leverage tells you what changed. And if you want to understand the future, always watch the leverage. Today, services, maritime services to be provided to Strait of Hormuz. So the Omani and Iranian sovereignty over the Gulf waters, or I would say Strait of Hormuz, is indirectly approved. And ability to do trade, ability to sell oil. So this is where we end today, and we'll see how the next 60 days unfold. Until then, bye-bye, take care.